this is kind of the main argument that I would like to make, and I look very much forward to feedback, because I may have it totally wrong, but the main point would be that, you know, the normative power idea had some brief period of dominance in the EU and in the scholarly community, but this has been changing. What we see in recent work is that, well, if you look at the Web of Science indices at the citations, you know, especially the Manners 2002 article is still being quoted many times and increasingly even. But my reading would be that there is less engagement with the normative power Europe argument than there used to be 5 to 10 years ago, and that even, you know, the whole normative power idea is more and more used as a straw man to oppose yourself against than as a serious idea to engage with, which leads me to several questions that I would like to address here, and I don't need to answer them because we have the whole day for that. But first of all, how did this normative power Europe concept originate? Secondly, if that's no longer the dominant thinking, then what is it? And finally, of course, how can this be explained? And with regard to the first question, I will point to what I would call the meta project behind normative power Europe, consisting of 4 elements, of which actually only one of them has really been taken very seriously. Secondly, as the title of course made it clear, I will talk about the idea of a superpower Europe, and finally I will try to point to the global European context, the academic context, and of course the political context. Theoretically, my research is largely based on discourse analysis, so I'm looking at the discourse here, not at what people would call facts or reality. And more specifically, I will look at academic discourse, because the assumption is that, you know, academic discourse and policy discourses can actually be very close, especially dominant academic discourse tends to reflect but also constitute dominant policy discourses, and this is also true for EU scholarship. And when it comes to normative power Europe, of course, a clear indication of this was Barroso saying, well, yes, the EU is more or less a normative power, taking up Ian Manners' concept. And there's several books, like perhaps the most well-known Leonard's book, Why Europe Will Learn in the 21st Century, 2005, also very indicative of this atmosphere of the first half of the 2000s. That was very popular and got distributed very well, and that actually takes up many of the arguments made by Manners and others. I say Manners and others because what is perhaps important to emphasize is that I would see the normative power Europe not as an idea, not as a theory, also not as a paradigm, but perhaps as a research program that was advanced and is being advanced, not just by Ian Manners with his famous article, his famous concept, but also by many others, including Richard Whitman, but many other scholars. So we're talking about a broader stream of scholars, a broader research paradigm than only Ian Manners' work. The context is quite obvious, I think. In the context of the end 90s, early 2000s, post-Cold War, the EU seeming to make qualitative leaps, the rise of ethical foreign policy, think of Tony Blair, government, the constructivist turn, the normative turn in international relations, in EU studies, etc. But first of all, we know the context. I think that's quite obvious. But what is it about, or what was it about? And of course, everyone working on normative power Europe will start by trying to define the concept. And you see that there are many definitions around, and everyone goes back to Manners 2002, sometimes to Manners' earlier work, but the problem is that you hardly get any clear definition. Define what passes for normal is mentioned, it has an ontological dimension, it has a normative dimension, you have the diffusion of norms, some have translated as being a force for the good. The point is that it is very unclear. There's lots of conceptual confusion on what exactly normative power is, and I don't think that this is a problem. I think on the contrary, this may first of all explain the popularity of the concept, that it allows us to discuss what is normative, what do we mean with normative. And I think that this may actually be part of the, I don't know, but I suspect that it might be part of the hidden agenda behind the normative power Europe project to allow for a critical debate on the question, what is the EU and what are the roles, how important is the ideational dimension in the EU? So we have the 4 elements that I identify here, and that is in my reading of the literature, the original literature, end 90s, early 2000s, and then the more recent writings. That is in my reading the core of the normative power Europe research program. So actually conceptual confusion helps us to think about these things, which is well, part of the meta project. So first of all, you have the ideational dimension. The idea was very much about bringing ideas back to the study of e-politics. After decades of focusing on instruments or of questions of capabilities, think of the capability expectations gap, actorness, what is an actor, should the EU be an actor or not, effectiveness, etc. So bringing back the focus on the substance and the content, and then including also the ideational dimension of politics. Still very relevant, I think, today. Then secondly, analytical, and I think there's a growing level of abstraction in the 4 elements that I'm going to mention, is about transcending the state. So going beyond the state-centered focus that has characterized international relations scholarship until today. The EU is some sort of a postmodern construction and maybe changing world structures. So also very much embedded in thinking on the English school or the reconvened English school, trying to get rid of the state lens and think of what is different about the EU as a polity, as a political construction. The third thing is more epistological. If you go through the original works and also more recent scholarship, you will see that there's an implicit, sometimes explicit, usually implicit call for eclecticism in studying IR, in studying EU politics, which is sort of a reaction against, positivist scholarship, positivist political science and IR scholarship that comes mostly from the US. And there have been calls for an European IR, European international relations, which may be less positivist, more interpretivist, which may be more sociological oriented, and which may in general be more eclectic. And the 4th dimension that I think is also of crucial importance is that much of the original normative power Europe scholarship, including Ian Manner's work, is actually very much embedded within critical social science perspectives. Despite it being eclectical, you also see that he's drawing heavily from critical science scholars, neo-Marxist, neo-Gramscian, but also postmodernist scholarship, and there's a clear normative agenda behind this, a clear normative approach. Normative, one of the objectives was clearly to bring normative political theory into EU studies and not to posit uncritically that the EU is a normative power. As I read it, the purpose was much more to problematize the EU and to question whether it might be or becoming a normative power, and more specifically, what that might be, what is normative, and how norms and ideas, etc. So actually trying to allow for a debate that we hadn't had until 10 years ago, a debate on what is normative about Europe, what is normative in general, rather than more problem-solving sort of theories. So, yeah. Another point I'd like to make is that most of the scholarship has focused on this ideas dimension, and as such, I think this is fine. I think this is also, to a large extent, the success of the normative power Europe idea, that it has indeed managed to provoke a serious engagement to the question, how important are ideas? Yeah? And even critics from realist corners, such as Adrian Hyde-Price, even critics from perhaps more post-structuralist perspective like Thomas Dietz, even they have engaged seriously in the idea, what is normative power like, and what is the role of ideas in European construction, how normative or how non-normative is the EU. So it has been successful in provoking a debate on all the questions that you have on the slide, and many of these will return in the course of the day if I go through the abstracts. The question For example, European versus cosmopolitan norms. Where do European norms come from? Is there something like distinctively EU norms or more international norms, for example, in development thinking? We'll have that clearly in Martin and Matthew's paper. The question, what is norms, ethics, values, what's different? Consistency, I think the question of consistency and double standards is also very clear in several of the papers today, especially when it comes to the EU relations with Russia and China. I think it's not accidental that we have several papers dealing with China and Russia here in this symposium, because this is clearly challenging for normative power. Your tension with interest, of course, rhetoric versus reality, for example. We'll have Milenko's paper, I think, on the EU and the Balkans. The question on norm takers, the receiving side of norms. I think Natalia's work on the norm taker side, the cultural filters that may play there. The question on diffusion mechanisms, and of course many case studies have been published in the past 10 to 15 years. So the point here is that, yes, I think Normative Power Europe scholarship has been successful in raising all these ideas and partly answering all these questions that are crucial to the EU Studies Centre. And in this sense, I think it's been major progress in EU studies. However, the broader questions have been more ignored. The broader epistemological, the critical dimension. I mean, you can study ideas. I mean, if you go back, you can study the ideational dimension, but still look at the EU as a state construct from a positive perspective and in a rather uncritical way. So the argument that I would like to develop in the paper, but I have to go through all the literature once again, is that the other dimensions have perhaps been ignored a bit more, and that increasingly, I think, starting in end 2000s, increasingly we see that scholars are less engaging in this original debate and are more superficially referring to Normative Power Europe. It's become an obligatory reference in academic writings.